Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this 5 and 25 webinar. I think this might be one of our largest audiences yet, so it's fantastic to see so many people joining us today. And today we're going to be talking about preparing public contracts, which is always an interesting and tricky topic. Just by way of introduction, I'm Jenny Beresford-Jones and I'm a Senior Legal Advisor and Public Procurement Specialist in the procurement team here at Mills & Reeve. And I'm here today with Claire and Kevin. Kevin Calder is a partner in the Commercial and Technology team here, and he specialises in IT contracts, often with a public sector focus. So he's regularly coming up against procurement rules. And Claire, many of you will have met already on these webinars. She's a Principal Associate and a Procurement and Contract Specialist, and we all work closely together on all things to do with procurement. Before we get started today, just a quick update on the progress of the procurement bill, because we've recently had the second draft of the bill published. I think that was published on October the 26th, and that's incorporated all the changes to the bill that have been agreed in Parliament so far. It's fair to say that those changes are really only tweaks to the first draft. There's no major shifts, I don't think. We've written a blog post on our procurement portal summarising the changes if anybody's interested in looking at that. And so the bill is now in its final report stage in the House of Lords before it moves to the House of Commons. The latest on timetable is still hoping for it to go live later in 2023 with a 6-month implementation period before that. Although of course it's possible as ever that timeline might slip. And if you're interested in procurement portal, in procurement law reform, do have a look at www.procurementportal.com/reform, which is our procurement portal page with everything to do with the progress of the procurement bill and all our good stuff, our client briefings and vlogs and our procurement phrase book and so on. Just a few points of housekeeping. To note that the webinar is being recorded, but please be reassured that nobody is actually visible on the recording apart from the speakers, so don't feel that you need to hide away. And that will be circulated after the event together with a copy of the slides, which everybody will get, and also our Q&A document, which will address any legal questions that you've asked us. So on that, if you've got any legal questions, do pop those in the Q&A box, and we'll try to address those as best we can afterwards. If you've got any technical issues, you can't hear us, you can't see us, again, use the Q&A box for that, and my colleague Sarah is going to be keeping an eye on that and trying to help anybody who's struggling to get connected. And finally, just on feedback, at the end of the session, a feedback form should pop up. We'd be really grateful if you could just spend a minute or two to fill that in, as it really helps us to design these sessions going forward. So I think on housekeeping, that was everything that I was going to say, and I think Claire is first up to talk to us about which form of public contract should an authority choose to use. Thank you, Claire.
Thanks, Jenny. So good morning, everybody. And the first place I thought might be helpful to start is to consider, well, what options are available to us when we're looking at contracts which sit alongside our procurement documents. And there are a number of options available, and picking the right one will really depend on what it is we're actually buying. So I'm going to run through what the typical options are in this scenario. So first of all, of course, many authorities will have their own standard terms and conditions, which are perfectly acceptable for buying fairly simple or straightforward goods or services procurements. They're generally, the only thing I would say is they're generally drafted very much in favour of the authority. So if you are dealing with a particular discerning bidder market, you might want to consider whether they're perhaps too much in favour of the authority, and you might get a bit pushback if you do try to impose those terms on the bidders. But again, perfectly acceptable to use if you're using you're purchasing fairly simple or straightforward goods or services contracts. If you're calling off a framework or a dynamic purchasing system, the form of contract is actually provided for you, And according to regulation 33(6) of the public contracts regulations, we should be using those terms and we shouldn't be making substantial changes to them. Now, we have done a separate webinar on framework agreements and call-offs, which you'll find on our YouTube channel. So I won't go into detail about that today. But of course, if you're calling off from a framework or a dynamic purchasing system, your template contract is dictated for you. There are many forms of recognised industry terms, some of which you might be familiar with, in particular for the construction industry and works contracts, NEC, JCT, and you might find that suppliers have particular preferences for certain types of contract versus others. And we'll talk a little bit about how you get to grips with what's more likely to be palatable to bidders in later in the webinar. There are also recognised precedents available, and CCS is often very good at providing those for us. If you are procuring something which is fairly complex, like an IT outsourcing project, the model services contract is generally accepted to be the standard template form of contract you will use for that procurement, and it will be familiar to a lot of the supplier market. It does require quite a bit of work to get it into a form where you can release it as part of your procurement pack, and we'll talk a little bit about that as well later. Or if you are procuring a framework agreement and you're setting a framework agreement up from scratch, there are things like the CCS public sector contract, which can provide a good starting place for you. So CCS is generally a good place to find common template forms of contract if you're starting from scratch and you're not quite sure where to look. Finally, if none of the other options are available to you, you can, of course, consider whether do we need a bespoke form of contract for our procurement? And that might be starting from a complete blank page from your own standard terms and conditions or one of the other forms of contract we've just mentioned above. While that can be very good in terms of it's tailored to your procurement, gives you more chance to think about what does the contract look like in this particular project. Of course, it will be a new contract to bidders. They won't be familiar with it. So you do need to perhaps be cognizant of the risk that they might want to push back on some of it unless you've really tested whether your bespoke contract is likely to be palatable to bidders. And again, we'll talk a little bit about that later on. So in summary, these are the general forms of contract available to you in terms of where you're asking your question, where do I start? So just move to the next slide. I did want to cover what the risks were in not getting that right. And some of you might be nodding your heads at this point thinking, yes, I've seen this before. Significant clarifications from bidders, requests for changes, bidders arguing about the form of contract you're using. It's not right for the procurement. So again, that is a risk if you don't really give that some thought at the start of the process. If the form of contract isn't right, of course, you can end up in a situation where you're negotiating with a successful bidder. And depending on what procedure we're using, it's either not permitted or there's extreme limitations on the extent to which we can negotiate with a successful bidder at contract award stage. Non-compliant tenders, again, that's an issue that does crop up where the form of contract isn't really appropriate for what you're buying. Often at the end of a process, bidders have to accept the final form of contract on a pass-fail basis or sign a document like a form of tender which says, if I am successful, I will enter into the form of contract which you've provided alongside the procurement documents. If we haven't used the right contract, of course, they might not be able to tick that box, and you might be in a scenario where you've got one or more non-compliant tenders, and worst case scenario, that leads to a failed procurement process. Next risk is disputes once we're in contract, again, where the contract doesn't cover everything it needs to. There are some gaping holes in issues you haven't covered in the contract that can end up in a dispute scenario if it's not clear who's supposed to be doing what and when. Misalignment with the specification, again, this is another common problem. If you're buying various different types of services, but your payment mechanism and your pricing template doesn't all align, it can be quite difficult to try and identify, well, where's the cost, what costs is for this service, what cost is for that service, was it included in this cost? So again, it's always good to check that all of that aligns. And if it's a particularly complicated form of pricing mechanism, you might want to look at the model services contract over your own standard terms and conditions for some ideas there. Additional costs for the authority where the obligation is not fully set out in the contract. Again, making sure it captures everything that it needs to, so there are no holes. And finally, battle of the forms. It doesn't tend to be such a problem in a scenario such as this, but suppliers will always take opportunities sometimes to try and incorporate their own terms, either in their tender submissions, in their form of tender, or even later down the line. So it is just something to be cognizant of generally in the context of public contracts as well. And now I'll pass to Kevin for question 2.
Thanks very much, Claire. So do I need to tailor and complete the contract prior to issuing it as part of the procurement documents? So Claire's been through the options in terms of which contract you might want to use for a public sector procurement. But once you've made that decision, what about tailoring the contract and schedules for the specific procurement in question? So our experience is that tailoring the contract's an area that is often overlooked in the rush to get a procurement pack ready. The standard public sector contracts which Claire has taken you through are, I'm afraid, not published in a form that's ready to go. But that's very deliberate. There are important decisions which can only be made once you know what you're buying. So why does providing a full and tailored contract actually matter? Well, in the open and restricted procedures, the aim is to issue a set of documents which will enable suppliers to respond with fully priced bids that are capable of acceptance by the contracting authority. So suppliers won't be able to provide those fully priced final bids without certainty on the contractual issues in the agreement and its schedules. So in the open and restricted procedures, there's no opportunity to negotiate the contract terms later. So there's a risk of a procurement breach where post-bid contract negotiation is ultimately needed to finalise the terms. Tailoring a contract can take some time, so do factor in the time required to your procurement timetable. So what actually needs tailoring in a standard contract? Well, it obviously varies between the different forms of contract, but typically a number of the schedules will need some thought before issue. So examples on the side here. So implementation, your high-level plan and milestones may need to be thought about and included. Pricing, when are you going to get paid? When is the supplier going to get paid? Service levels and credits, where it's a service you're procuring. Insurance cover details and details around the governance arrangements. But there is some good news. Some of these standard forms of contracts do come with helpful guidance on how to prepare them for issue and what the key points to consider are. For example, the model services contract, which Claire mentioned, has a guidance document with a forward from Jacob Rees-Mogg, of all people, and the NHS standard terms of purchase, which has a handy table setting out what needs completing. So what about if you're using a framework? Well, even where you're using a framework call-off, whilst the aim is to have most of the terms standardized, there will often still be choices left to make before you carry out the procurement process. So, for example, what are your expectations around whether TUPE will apply, security obligations, do you need higher or standard security, and financial stability rating requirements? So can I leave any points to be completed later? Yes, you can. Some elements do need to be left until the supplier bids have been received and the content potentially is taken from the bids themselves, including price details and often specific details of how the chosen supplier will deliver the service or meet the requirement for goods. But it's key to ensure that all points which clarify the authority's requirements have been completed first where using the open or restricted procedure. So what about competitive dialogue or competitive with negotiation? Well, if you are using those processes, you can leave more to be discussed as part of that dialogue or negotiation. That's kind of the point. However, it does remain important to have a baseline starting point for suppliers to bid against or to use as a starting point for dialogue. And that's likely to still require contracting authorities to at least offer a starting position around what they're looking for in key areas, such as implementation and service levels. Don't use the competitive dialogue or negotiated procurement process as an excuse to delay finalising key decisions which the authority is already in a position to make. So in summary, the answer to the second question is almost always yes. You should expect to need to tailor the standard form contracts so they're suitable to publish as part of your procurement document pack Make sure you allow time to do so. And whilst this does involve some upfront effort, it should get authorities better value for money bids and reduce clarifications and post-bid discussions with suppliers. So Jenny, on to question 3.
Thank you, Kevin. So yes, so question 3 is really around, should we be allowing tenderers to amend the contract once we've published it as part of the procurement process? And I guess the first point here is, why would an authority wish to do this? And I think it's usually where the authority believes that doing so will maximise the chance of the procurement being successful and to avoid the problems that come with having a flawed procurement process, some of which are set out on the slide there. And as Kevin said, the procurement rules do have a couple of processes which actually anticipate phases of negotiation, and that could well be negotiation of the contract. But those processes, that's the competitive dialogue and the competitive negotiation, are only really suitable for the most complex procurements, and they're not commonly used. What about if you're using a more standard, ordinary, open or restricted process? In terms of initial considerations about allowing feedback or seeking amendments, I think the headline point is that this does carry some procurement risk. And if you don't need to do it and you can avoid doing it, that's great. And I think it's really important to properly interrogate whether this is the route you want to go down before you set off down that road. And on the slide there, there's some questions that you might ask yourself. If having done that analysis, you do think that seeking feedback is something that you need to do, we think really there are sort of 2 options. The first one is to seek unscored feedback really as part of a pre-market engagement exercise before you go out to tender. And then option 2, which is a little bit more tricky, as we'll see, is to invite bidders to mark up the terms and conditions of the contract and then score that. So just turning to option 1, which is where we are using pre-market engagement to seek feedback on the form of contract that the authority is intending to use. So the way you do this is you run some sort of pre-market engagement exercise and you see whether your contract is workable or whether it seems to be more of a barrier to the success of the procurement. And if it is, you reconsider those terms and conditions before you actually go out to tender. So from a transparency perspective, you do need to factor in sufficient time for this pre-market engagement phase, but we usually advise that this always pays dividends further down the line, as you can be confident that you've issued a contract which is likely to be acceptable to bidders. There could also be an equal treatment issue. So, for example, how do you decide which bidder feedback to accept? And it is okay to accept certain feedback only, but do keep in mind the rules at Reg 40 and 41 of the Public Contracts Regs around pre-market engagement and prior involvement of bidders, and just make sure that your paper trail account of your pre-market engagement does demonstrate that the feedback you took on board was done so for objectively justifiable reasons and not with any intention to unfairly advantage a particular bidder. Just on option 2, just to sort of reiterate what Kevin said earlier, really, an open restricted process is designed to produce a contract which is capable of acceptance without further amendment, no negotiation needed with tenderers. And in contrast to that, the 2 negotiated processes, competitive dialogue and competitive procedure with negotiation, are intended to permit negotiation, although it is true that there's a possibility of accepting initial tenders in the negotiated procedure there. But that's the conceptual split between these processes. So inviting markups is, if you're in a restricted or open process, is, I think, fair to say, suboptimal and not risk-free. And if you think that you're needing to do this, you should be sort of having a bit of a sense check about whether really you need to switch process to one of the dialogue processes. But if you're going to go ahead, I think there is a way that we have seen it done, which is where you are inviting tenderers to suggest amendments to the contract or indeed to selected clauses. If you're going to do that, you need to articulate a very clear method of evaluating the proposed amendments, and this is usually scored based on the degree of risk transfer to the authority involved in the amendments proposed. And if a bidder makes no amendments, typically that will score full marks. In terms of the contract, that is as offered, including the amendments proposed, so that you can see that in a way it's within the characteristic of a restricted or open process. There's no negotiation, and the contract is accepted as offered. And because of that, it's important for the authority to reserve the right to reject the tender in its entirety if the proposed amendments are not acceptable. And it's also important that your procurement documents make it clear to tenderers that they will not have an opportunity to roll back their amendments at some later stage, because this is not a negotiation. And I think that was what I was going to say on amendments to the contract. And then I think Claire is going to talk to us about contractualising the winning bid. Thanks, Claire.
Thanks, Jenny. So this is an area which is often overlooked, but it's actually very important to get this right, as it can lead, not getting it right can lead to a scenario where you find yourself negotiating with the successful bidder post-contract award. And we talked earlier about that's not necessarily permissible, particularly in certain procedures, or entering into a contract which doesn't deliver what you're expecting. So this does need to be given some thought before we commence the procurement process. So a few of the things you might want to consider: firstly, using the procurement process to pre-populate the schedules that will go into the contract. So the types of scenarios where you might want to do this is if you're asking for an implementation or mobilisation plan, if you're asking for a security management plan, if the supplier is going to be providing some sort of input into your IT systems or holding data for you. You can actually collect this information as part of the procurement process. You can evaluate it as a qualitative criterion, and you can issue guidance to bidders to explain to them how it needs to be drafted. Tenders are often drafted in a very different type of language to contracts, and therefore it's not always easy to contractualise something which is written in a tender into a form which is suitable to be used in a contract. Therefore, you can consider issuing a guidance document which explains to bidders it needs to be clear where you're going to be doing something, where an obligation's on us, where an obligation's on you. Another thing which helps with that is to actually say within the body of the question, your response. Here you're going to be asked to submit an implementation plan, and your response to this question will be Schedule 2 of the contract once we have a position where we have a successful bidder. Secondly, ensure the tender response is aligned to the contract. I've already touched on that in question 1 earlier. This is a particular problem in terms of getting the pricing right and making sure that matches with the specification, matches with the payment mechanism, making sure your contract is as ready to go as possible for contract award. Ensure there is a binding obligation on the successful bidder to deliver the promises set out in its tender. Now, this seems quite obvious, but again, it's an area which is commonly overlooked. Unless you have a binding obligation in your contract which obliges the bidder to deliver, successful bidder to deliver its tender, it can be quite difficult to unpick it later down the line. Well, what were they responsible for? What were we paying for this service? And if you've got a very lean contract with a very lean specification, you're reliant on what is said in the tender and the successful bidder delivering that. So always consider including an express binding obligation for the successful bidder to deliver what it said it was going to do in its tender, because that's what you want. That's why you've chosen them as a successful bidder. Now, connected to that is the order of precedence. And for those of you who are not familiar with this, the order of precedence sets out what order applies where there could be conflicts between different documents. So in a procurement process, we obviously have the contract itself, but we might also have the specification, we'll have the tender submission for the successful bidder. So clearly setting out, well, what happens if all of those documents conflict, which document trumps which and in what order. It's already set out for you in most common forms of contracts. So if you're using the model services contract or any form of CCS contract or a call-off contract, it will already be set out for you. But if you're using a bespoke contract, make sure you've got that in there. The last thing you potentially want are the supplier's terms or the supplier's tender, but potentially trumping your own terms and conditions, which you've taken the time to consider and draft. And finally, social value and innovation. There's often a lot of focus on this in the procurement process. Bidders come up with fantastic ideas to facilitate social value, innovation. But the important part is, well, how does that work once we're in contract? So considering things like having a schedule for a social value plan, having a schedule for an innovation plan, thinking about KPIs, making sure they're monitored against what they said they will deliver in that plan. And again, going back to the first bullet point, using the procurement process to capture that information so it can go straight into the contract at contract signature. Thank you very much. I'll pass back to.
Thanks very much, Claire. So question 5, our final question today, and it's a cracker. What should I do if a bidder insists on contracting on its own standard terms and conditions? It's becoming an increasingly common question in our experience. So we've had several emails on the topic even before today's session. And it typically crops up in industries where the suppliers just won't seem to move on their terms. So good examples are software licensors and also online service providers, where you often hear the argument that because it's a shared service provided to many customers, the supplier cannot tailor the terms for each individual customer. So why is using supplier terms a problem? Well, contracting authorities have an overarching obligation of transparency. Essentially, you'll be clear about what you're going to do, and then you'll do what you've said. And in this case, transparency requires providing the proposed contract terms up front, so all bidders can see what they're expected to bid against. There's also a specific obligation in Regulation 53 of the Public Contracts Regulations to publish procurement documents up front, which will include the contract. So how can a contracting authority balance these obligations with the need to ensure market participation in the process? Because in some areas of procurement, if you publish a standard mandatory contract, you risk few or no bidders, even where you've tried to accommodate the key bidder concerns in the drafting. So what is our simple, clear and risk-free solution to this problem? Well, I'm sorry, but there is no perfect and risk-free answer that we've been able to identify, but we are going to look at 2 possible options. The first we're calling the hybrid approach, and the second using key commercial principles. But it is worth saying as a spoiler alert that neither is wholly risk-free from a procurement law perspective. So the first of those 2, the hybrid approach, potentially works where the element which needs to have supplier standard terms is not the entirety of the contract. So in some procurements, it's worth considering whether you can use a standard public sector contract alongside a supplier's license or similar attached. So if this option is used, it's important to try and limit the extent of the supplier terms. So for example, to a bare intellectual property license, by which I mean simply the license grant itself and any limitations on the scope of that license. Using this option does require some careful bespoke drafting and use of appropriate precedence provisions, Claire mentioned them earlier, to address any conflicts between the public sector and the supplier terms. It's also important to make sure any entire agreement provisions work as intended, where you've got effectively 2 sets of terms forming one agreement. The best known example of this in practice is G-Cloud, where CCS have adopted this sort of approach. The G-Cloud contract is a hybrid of CCS and supplier terms, and there are provisions ensuring that the key public sector terms take precedence over relevant provisions in the supplier's terms and conditions. So pros and cons of this approach. Well, pros, using this approach does enable you to publish the contract in advance. So it's a tick for Regulation 53, or at least most of the contract in advance. And also it does limit the scope of deviations from the public sector terms to a specific area. Cons, well, it requires some drafting effort to ensure the terms work as a whole. There is a risk of scope creep. suppliers will sometimes try and stick liability or payment provisions into their standard terms, and that can result in duplication, leaving the overall contract difficult to interpret. And then there is arguably still a lack of transparency where you are permitting supplier terms if they're not evaluated, because those terms may well transfer differing levels of risk to the authority. So our second option is key commercial principles. And in this option, those key commercial principles, or KCPs, are published at the start of the procurement process instead of a contract. So those KCPs are a list of the key commercial and legal objectives of the authority, often provided in relatively short bullet point format. And they sometimes include red lines or must-haves. And for this option to work, the authority must also publish an evaluation methodology which allows for evaluating the proposed supplier contract terms against the authority's KCPs. And that could look at, for example, the extent of deviation from the KCPs and the level of risk transfer to the public authority. So pros and cons of this option. Well, pros, it gives the authority full flexibility to accept standard supplier terms, which is very helpful in some markets. It is in theory less complex to draft because there's no upfront public sector contract, but you do still need to draft the evaluation methodology. The resulting contract's likely to be cleaner and easier to interpret. But in terms of cons, well, query if it strictly complies with Regulation 53, the requirement to publish a contract I mentioned earlier. It can be complex to evaluate the supplier terms against the KCPs. There's a risk the terms provided by the supplier breach the authority's red lines or are just too onerous to accept, and the authority needs to be very clear about what happens in those circumstances. It remains a risk that evaluation basis is seen as too subjective. What's a minor deviation, what's a substantial deviation, and therefore lacks transparency, and that could be challenged. And it may result in an overall lower risk transfer to suppliers because effectively they can use their preferred terms. So I'm afraid we haven't got a risk-free solution to this growing problem, but you can significantly mitigate the risk by being upfront and clear as to the authority's proposed approach. And doing so will mean in many cases, any challenge to the structure of the process will be effectively timed out before you get to evaluation of the bids. Thanks. Jenny.
Thank you, Kevin. I think that brings us to the end of our webinar today. As ever, please look out for the follow-up email which will come around, and that will include the recording, a copy of the slides, and our Q&A document. And if you're able to leave us any feedback, that would be most appreciated. And our next webinar is on the 12th of January 2023, where we'll be talking about procurement challenges. That's always a hot topic. So thanks very much, everybody, for joining us, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.